Welcome to Victor's Children, a podcast from so-called Canada talking socialism from below. My name is David Canfield. I live with my partner and cat in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. All those of us in the Canadian state who aren't Indigenous need to commit ourselves to the struggle against settler colonialism. Victor's Children is a member of the Harbinger Media Network, a community working to promote left podcasts in Canada. Check out the list of Harbinger podcasts at harbingermedianetwork.com. If you're serious about socialist politics, you recognize that socialists need to work together. For a socialist to not be a member or at least a supporter of any socialist political organization is a sign that either they're living somewhere where there's no group that's worth joining, which is sadly true in too many places today, or that the person's not serious about being politically active. But does the need for socialists to be organized to be as effective as possible mean that socialist groups today should consider themselves to be parties or the beginnings of parties? How can we best work towards socialist political organizations that genuinely deserve to be called parties? These are the questions that this episode's guest, Charlie Post, and I are going to discuss. So, Charlie, could you introduce yourself and tell listeners about your political background, particularly with respect to these issues?
Okay. I live in New York City, have been living in New York for about 40 years now. I'm originally from New York. And being that I'm a bit older than you, I'm actually part of the sort of tail end of the generation of what was sometimes called the generation of 68. I radicalized as a young teenager around Vietnam and the black struggle in the U.S. and became a Marxist in the wake of the postal wildcat strike of 1970, where for the first time I saw how the capacity of industrial workers to exercise much more social power than students and other categories. And I saw the effects of collective struggle on working class consciousness. So around the time I started, that was around the time I was 16, I started looking for a Marxist group to join. And I ended up, shortly after I turned 17, joining the youth group of what was then the largest Trotskyist organization in the United States, the U.S. Socialist Workers' Party, which had very different politics than the British Socialist Workers' Party, which most people are familiar with. I was involved in a series of debates there, was thrown out, expelled in 1974. I was involved in various attempts to create groups and ended up coming around in the late 1970s, early 1980s, a group of comrades who were both coming out of my political tradition, which was the wing of the European-based Fourth International, and coming out of the U.S. International Socialist called Workers' Power. And it was from there, Workers' Power became involved in a regroupment of three small socialist groups in 1986 that formed Solidarity, and I was a member of Solidarity until 2015. There was a period of time where I did not feel I could actually join a group and be a committed member, but I became one of the founding members of the Tempest Collective, of which both you and I are members. Now, this experience for me, particularly looking at not only the attempts by various Trotskyist groups that were committed in one way or another to the politics of revolutionary socialism from below, to transform small groups of former students into either the core of a revolutionary party with real influence among working people. Not only the failure of that effort, but the effort of every other current on the left to be able to make that transition, including the much larger and more influential currents influenced by Maoism and so-called Marxism-Leninism. Part of the foundation of Solidarity was a recognition that that model of building a socialist group was a dead end. And over time, through discussions within Solidarity, through our experimentations in practice, etc., myself and another comrade wrote a pamphlet for the organization called Socialist Organization Today, which is available on the Solidarity website, in which we try to explain why the various attempts of small groups to transform themselves into the core or an actual revolutionary party had failed in the late 60s, early 70s, and why a different model of revolutionary socialist organization was necessary. And I think, and while I left Solidarity for very specific political reasons that had less to do with its organizational, but its political perspective, I felt comfortable being part of the group of comrades who formed Tempest, because they too recognized the limits of many of them coming out of the International Socialist Organization in the United States, the failure of what they labeled the so-called microsect model. So my thinking on this has been shaped by that nearly a little over 5 decades of political activity, an attempt to understand why, despite the best efforts of very committed, very honest revolutionaries in the late 60s and early 70s, to actually become a significant organization that's able to influence the course of working class struggles, failed so miserably, and what revolutionary socialists need to do today to prepare for that eventuality, but without pretending to be it in miniature.
Thanks for that. And we're going to pick up on some of these things that you've talked about as we go. I should mention that for my part, the first socialist group I was in was the International Socialists, which I joined in 1988 and left early in 1996. Along with a minority of other IS members who, along with some other socialists, then formed the New Socialist Group, which formally dissolved in 2017. In the early 1990s, the IS had become more aggressively self-promoting, declaring that it was beginning to build a revolutionary party, and this was a shift that was happening across the international network headed by the Socialist Workers' Party in Britain, a network called the IS Tendency. Canadian IS was its affiliate. And that shift led to changes in the group that a couple of years later led to the split that I was part of. So the New Socialist Group, which I was in, rejected the idea that tiny socialist groups should try to organize as if they were socialist parties, but only smaller, the so-called micro-party or microsect model. Some people also call that vanguardism. Okay, that's enough about us. Let's dig into this. So to start with, there's some debate among socialists about whether socialist parties are even needed for the transformation of society. More debate, though, about what kind of party would be needed, and then even more debate about how to work towards the creation of such parties. Before we talk about those things, though, we need to clarify by what exactly we mean by a revolutionary socialist party, since I think there are a lot of misunderstandings about that. So what's your take on that?
A revolutionary socialist party that actually is an organization that organizes a substantial portion of the most militant and radical working class militants in a given society, and that has the ability to actually influence the course of social and class struggles. I believe such a party is necessary. I believe organization is necessary because I believe that working class consciousness always develops episodically and unevenly. And this comes from the basic tenet of socialism from below, is that it's through the self-activity of working people coming together, striking in a workplace, confronting a landlord, opposing an imperialist war, etc. It is through these activities and through confronting the state and capital that people develop radical consciousness, a notion that their interests are fundamentally different and opposed to those of capital and the state, and that there is a need for a fundamentally different type of society. Now, because working people, in their vast majority, cannot be always engaged in struggle, particularly strike activity, because, as Marx tells us, we're separated from the means of production, and we need to sell our labor power and go to work for capitalists and be exploited in order to survive, which means that working people enter struggle episodically, and consciousness develops unevenly. Without organizing those who've come to similar conclusions, those lessons and ideas get dissipated. So I believe that a revolutionary socialist party is necessary, but that's got to be a party that actually has a real roots in a large layer of the working class that is actually radicalized. And it's because that layer doesn't exist for very specific historical reasons that I believe that many of the previous, and I can go into this in detail later, many of these previous attempts to turn small groups into revolutionary parties have failed. So, no, but, yeah.
So let's dig into the history of socialist party building and go back to the beginning in the late 1800s. Do you want to start taking us through some of that history?
All right. Well, you begin to see the emergence of independent working class and socialist groupings as early as the 1860s and 1870s. Many of these groups get grouped together in what was called the International Workingmen's Association, or the First Socialist and Labor International. Many of these parties, organizations, were relatively small, a few thousand members, but they had real roots among the more militant, the more radical layers of workers. Most of them did not survive the downturn of the late 1870s, early 1880s, the economic downturn. Now, in the period of the 1880s and 1890s, there's a long period of relative capitalist stagnation. There's low profits, there's continuous recessions, etc. But what you see in this period is wave after wave after wave of working class struggles, most of them in defense of wages, working conditions, etc., which in a number of countries, particularly in capitalist Europe, Germany being the most important, but also to some extent France, Italy, and etc., and in the United States, you see the emergence of what we can call small mass parties with 20, 30, 40, 50,000 members, with some ability to actually contest elections and elect working class representatives to various legislative or parliamentary bodies. These were based on relatively small, what we would today call non-majority unions. Most of them are organized along industrial lines, but generally whose membership were radicalized, skilled workers, machinists, etc. In other countries, France, Spain, Portugal, other parts of the world, we see as well the emergence of mass trade unions that present themselves as revolutionary. You see the growth of what's sometimes called revolutionary syndicalism. Now, capitalism enters a period of growth and high profitability between the mid-1890s and the First World War. In this period, we see the emergence of truly massive working class parties and radical political organizations. The largest that emerge, and again, emerges out of a wave of strikes. First in the 1890s, then around 1905, 1907, the most visible manifestation of that being the Russian Revolution of 1905, 1906, and then a wave of strikes between 1911 and 1913-14, which are confronting issues of de-skilling, etc. And you see the emergence of mass parties. So in Germany, the largest being in Germany, the German Social Democratic Party, which is hard as it will be for those who are familiar with the German social democracy today to believe, presented itself to the world as a revolutionary party, as a party intent upon the destruction of capitalism and its replacement with socialism. You saw similar-sized parties to some extent in Italy, in the underground, in the Russian Empire, in France, the United States, etc. These parties brought together layers of militant workers, what we can call a real workers' vanguard, the shop floor and community leaders who attempted to continue the struggle between mass upsurges and who actually could lead real working class struggles. Included them, but it also included these social democratic parties before World War I, include a growing layer of full-time officials, both of the trade unions that are beginning to be legalized and stabilized in Western Europe, the US, and other places, and party officials, full-timers who work on the newspaper, the organization of the party, and who, in particular, represented in various legislative and parliamentary bodies. This gives rise within these parties to continuous tensions between a revolutionary left wing and a more what we would call reformist right wing and center. So that if you look at the German social democracy, the first manifestation of this is in the late 1890s at a split between the majority of the party and the so-called revisionists around Edvard Bernstein. By 1910, 1911, we're seeing a three-way differentiation between a right wing of trade union and party officials, a center around Karl Kautsky, which still claims to be Marxist and revolutionary, and a left wing that is arguing much more for let's break with these reformists and really prepare the working class today for a revolutionary struggle through mass action, mass strikes around people like Luxembourg in Germany. You start to see people like the emergence of people like Antonio Gramsci and Amedeo Borga in Italy, and in Russia around what becomes known as the Bolshevik faction of the social democracy. We also see in this period the growth in many countries of revolutionary syndicalism, of attempts to build unions that are not only trying to organize workers around their immediate interests, whether wages, hours, and most importantly, working conditions, but also are preparing for explicitly revolutionary and anti-capitalist. The best known to people in North America is the Industrial Workers of the World, the Wobblies, which in Canada was the one big union. 1914 in the First World War creates a schism within this growing wave of independent mass political and industrial organization. The question of whether or not to support your government in an imperialist war leads to schisms in all these parties. Those schisms crystallize in the years after the Russian Revolution, when the Bolsheviks, who were a very unique formation, which I can go into later if you'd like, unique formation in that the Bolsheviks were able to build a revolutionary party even under Tsarist repression because in Russia, because it was an absolutist autocracy, there was no space to consolidate a layer of officials either in trade unions or parliament because unions were not legal for the most part, and parliament was an empty shell in Russia. So the Bolsheviks essentially built an organization of the most radical and revolutionary workers. By 1913, they have recruited most of the leaders of the big strike waves in the big factories in Moscow, Petrograd, etc. In the wake of the Russian Revolution, socialists and radicals all over the world start making choices about their organizational affiliation. And what we see by 1921-22 is that in several countries, particularly Germany, the communist parties become truly mass parties. The German Communist Party in 1921-22 had 400,000 members. I once did a calculation and found that would be the equivalent of 1.2 million workers in the United States. And it was a party mostly made up of industrial workers and their family members, particularly in the metalworking industries. In other countries, we see smaller mass parties, to some extent, Italy, France, and then even in countries where you have what have become known as the small communist parties, Britain, the United States, Canada, these parties gather together tens of thousands of experienced working class militants, both from the left wing of the socialist parties that existed in these countries and recruit from the ranks of revolutionary syndicalists. Now, through the 1920s, these parties struggled with varying degrees of success, particularly in what we today call the global north, to displace social democracy, reformism, as the main voice of the working class. They had some degrees of success, depending on the pace of the class struggle, but they had, through the 20s, organized and consolidated a layer of radicalized, revolutionary-minded workers. So just to give you an example on the small end of the scale, in 1928, on the eve of the Depression in the United States, the Communist Party had gone through several very damaging splits, but it still had a membership of 10 to 15,000 workers, which today would be 100,000, and it was the largest organization of radicalized revolutionary workers in the United States. In Germany, in the late 20s, the party had 500,000 or 600,000 members. Now, the big problem was that the communist parties, which had been grouped together in a new international, the Communist International, the Third International, that international and those parties became increasingly dominated by and eventually subservient to the emerging new ruling class in Russia. As the Russian Revolution was isolated, as both the council democracy, Soviet democracy, and party democracy were strangled in the Soviet Union, a new ruling class emerged around the officialdom of the party and the state. And this officialdom justified itself as building socialism in one country, and basically saw the communist parties not as instruments of world revolution who needed to be rooted in their national realities to advance the class struggle, but as Trotsky put it, as border guards for the Soviet Union, as parties that would somehow keep the capitalist powers from strangling the Stalinist ruling class's attempt to build so-called socialism in one country. This led to tremendous distortions and errors in political orientation. From 1928 to 33, the communist parties proclaimed that capitalism in the West was entering its terminal crisis. And in this terminal crisis, the only thing that kept capitalism in power was the social democracy. And communist parties around the world labeled the social democratic parties social fascist parties, and said, in fact, they were the main enemy, not actually growing fascism in countries like Germany. This policy leads to sharp divisions in the labor movement and the inability to, particularly in Germany, to mount a united front in the streets, not in the voting ballot box, but in the streets to stop the fascist gangs. Hitler takes power, and the Communist Party firmly believes that Hitler will last a few weeks and then they will come to power. A year later, Hitler has actually demolished the oldest, largest, and best organized working class movement in the world. The mass parties, both of social democracy and communism, and the largest trade union movement in the world, has been completely decimated. In the wake of this, the Communist parties the Communist International now realizes that it's got a very potent threat practically on its borders in fascist Germany and fascist Italy, and begins to search for an alternative strategy to protect itself. After a couple of years of experimentation, they hit upon what is known as the Popular Front. And the Popular Front essentially marked the communist parties adapting the Social Democrats' strategy for fighting fascism and fighting reaction, which rested not on working class unity in the streets and on the picket lines, etc., to confront fascist gangs and build a militant workers' movement, but instead looked to electoral alliances, both with the reformist party, political parties like social democracy, but also with liberal capitalists, which looked to not towards building what we would call a rank and file movement in workplaces and unions, but instead looking to align communists with progressive trade union officials. This became their strategy. Now, this strategy in countries like France and Spain were incredible disasters. In Spain, they led to the derailing and defeat of an actual possible workers' revolution in Spain. In France, there were mass strikes, a general strike in mid-1936, which the Communist Party disorganized. Now, the Popular Front strategy adopted in 1935-36, then shapes the trajectory politically and I would argue sociologically of the communist parties for the next 70 years. These parties become, particularly after the Second World War, when they grow to mass scale in countries like Italy and France, because of their role in the anti-Nazi resistance, and in many other countries, become essentially parties of left-wing reform, no longer of revolution. They recruit and educate people on the basis of revolution is somewhere off way in the distance. And what today we need to do is build a progressive alliance in one form or another, which includes not only reform socialists, it includes trade union officials, and it includes certain liberal capitalists, those who are willing to defend democracy, and also, as a bonus points, enter into diplomatic alliances with the Soviet Union. This not only changes the political coloration of the communist parties, it changes its sociological character. Before the mid-30s, the Communist Party recruited the most militant working class people who were intent upon finding every possible way to advance the struggle against the boss, the landlord, the state, and who particularly in the workplaces saw themselves as independent of the full-time officialdom of the unions, which they saw correctly, in my opinion, as inherently conservative. After 1935-36, as the communist parties begin to become integrated into that trade union officialdom, and particularly after Second World War, where in some countries they lead not only the so-called left wing of the officialdom, as they do in Britain and a couple of other countries, but in France and Italy, they become the officials of the largest trade union federations. At that point, people who join the communist parties are not the most uncompromising workplace militants who are willing to do anything possible to stop the boss, including go up against their union leaders. The Communist Party becomes a vehicle to be recruited. If you join the Communist Party, this is a way you can become an official. If you join the party, you can become a shop steward and get time off from work. If you move up correctly and you play the game, you can become a full-time official of a local or an international, etc. Thus, the communist parties, by the late 1950s, early 1960s, were no longer mass organizations of revolutionary-minded workers, but mass organizations of workers who basically looked to left-talking, left-leaning trade union officials and sought to become part of that. Now, this, in my opinion, poses a huge problem, huge and unacknowledged problem for the layers of young people who radicalize from the mid-60s to the mid-1970s. That part of the generation I was part of. These are people who radicalized initially in France around the Algerian War, globally around Vietnam, around anti-racist struggles, and who increasingly are trying to relate to growing working class militancy at the workplace, growing wave of unofficial wildcat strikes, etc., which culminate in 1968-69 in mass strikes in the May-June events in France of 68, and then what's called the long 68 in Italy, of continuous strikes and confrontations, workplace occupations, which also are manifested in almost every industrialized country. In the US and Canada, which are the more politically conservative labor movements, even there you see sharp increases in strike activity, much of it opposed by the official leaders of the unions. In this cauldron, thousands of young people, mostly college students and ex-college students, but some young workers who were increasingly alienated by the war, racism, and by the incredibly alienated and degraded work they have to do in factories, begin to move left. And many of them correctly say, okay, if we're serious about revolutionary politics, we've got to form organizations, and we eventually have to build a party. Now, most of us at that point, and I will include myself as a somewhat naive late teen, early 20s person, believed that we were in a new epic of world revolution, equivalent to that we saw sweep across the world from 1917 to 1923, and that our small revolutionary organization, we were going to see, especially as the global economic crisis takes hold in the early 70s, we're going to see growing class battles. The labor officials will be unable to deal with the capitalist offensive, and that this will create the opportunities to build new mass revolutionary parties. What we didn't acknowledge was that there had been a break in the history of what we can actually call a workers' vanguard, the layer of radical and revolutionary-minded workers that had been created through those generations of battles from the 1870s, 1880s through the 1930s, that layer had been disorganized both politically and ideologically by the Popular Front politics and sociologically by its increasing integration into the trade union officialdom. So what you see again in the late 60s, early 70s is dozens of groups throughout the capitalist world, whether they are leaning towards some variant of socialism from below or some version of so-called Marxist-Leninism, usually inspired by Maoism and the Chinese Revolution. These groups throw themselves into working class struggles, centralize themselves, quote, Bolshevize themselves, become really tough, clamp down on internal discussion, have a, quote, authoritarian leaderships, and believe that if they just pursue their line, and by acting as parties in miniature, the microsect, they can become mass parties. With very, very few exceptions, these end in disaster. I mean, the two exceptions of groups that were able to get through this period and have some cadre and some base among a much thinner layer of workers were the Ligue communiste révolutionnaire in France, which had maybe 1,000, 2,000, the equivalent of 5 to 10,000 in the US or Canada today, members, and what becomes the British Socialist Workers' Party, which also has several thousand members and had some real influence in British society. Now, for a variety of reasons, these groups begin to implode in the early part of this century. So we'll leave them to the side. But for the most part, what you see, and this is very clear to me in the US, and I imagine it's very similar in Canada. Most of my generation, people who had gone into party building activity, whether of a Trotskyist variant or a Maoist variant, end up by the 80s either leaving politics completely or simply becoming reformist socialists. I mean, by 1984, 85, almost everyone I knew who had been a Maoist back in the 60s and 70s were eagerly supporting Jesse Jackson's run in the Democratic primaries. People who had believed that every trade union official above a shop steward was automatically a sellout were now pursuing careers in the trade union officialdom, either as elected officers or as staffers. Now, this then leads to a period of experimentation from the 90s onward. And then from the 90s onward, what we start to see for a period up until very recently is the emergence of new parties. The most successful of this was the Workers' Party in Brazil, which emerges out of continued struggles in the 70s and 80s in the workplaces, in the favelas, etc., and brings together, these are broad parties in a sense. They look in some ways like pre-war social democracy. They bring together both radicalized layers of workers and intellectuals and some left-leaning trade union officials, parliamentary politicians, etc. So you see the emergence of the Workers' Party. You see the emergence of what's called the Party of Communist Refoundation in Italy. You see groups like Die Linke in Germany emerging by the late 80s, early 90s, all of which are attempting to respond to both the failure of these previous revolutionary party building movements, and the crisis of reformism. Because what we start to see by the late 80s, early 90s is that both the social democratic parties and what's left of the communist parties after the collapse of the so-called actually existing socialism, as you use that phrase in Red Flags, they are no longer even capable of successfully fighting for reforms. They basically capitulate to neoliberalism, to austerity, etc. And these parties, for periods of time, have some resonance, but all of them go through their own crises, as tensions between the two wings, the radicalized, revolutionary-minded base and their officials, lead them into impasses. Now, I firmly believe that these sorts of broad parties will continue to emerge, because the revolutionary left, in my opinion, is not the material conditions for the revolutionary left to transform itself into a mass independent revolutionary party simply don't exist. And because the official parties of the labor movement and the left have abandoned even the struggle for reform. So we see again today the emergence of, more recently, there's a revival of Die Linke in Germany. They throw out some of their most extreme right-wing elements, and the party started to grow again. You saw and you see in Britain, YourParty, which seems to be intent on aborting itself before it's even born. But again, so just to sum up, and this is a sort of broad sweep, from the 1870s to the 1930s, we see through continuous waves of working class struggles, the emergence of a true mass working class vanguard of radicalized workers who are active in their neighborhoods, their workplaces, etc., who form the left wing first before the first world of social democracy, and then become the mass base of communism in the 1920s and 30s. As the communist parties are bureaucratized, Stalinized, subordinated to the ruling elites, the ruling classes in the Soviet Union and then later China, etc. These groups, while going on zigs and zags through ultra-leftism, fundamentally move in a reformist direction and become themselves very similar to the mass social democratic parties. This not only politically disorients radical workers, it transforms them sociologically from workplace and community fighters into candidates to become full-time officials. This throws up a tremendous obstacle to the party building efforts of the 60s and 70s. And since then, the left what's left of the revolutionary left has tried to figure out how to proceed in situation that all of us find complete, in many ways, unexpected.
That's a very helpful overview of a lot of history. So thanks for that, Charlie. Let's go back now and just pick up on the thread about the so-called party building groups that started to emerge in the late 60s. As you said, most of those groups had either collapsed or shrunk dramatically by the time we get to the early 1980s. And these groups attracted lots of very committed young fighters of your generation. Why do those groups, do you think, do so poorly? If you want to zero back in on that question, many people today who went through that experience, and lots of people who didn't but watched them, would say that was because any kind of revolutionary politics is wrong. But I think that's not a very helpful explanation.
Well, I think absolutely. It's not because revolution is impossible. It's certainly not because a revolutionary transformation of society is not necessary to the future survival of our species. That I'm, completely convinced of. It fails for a variety of reasons. The most fundamental was that the human material, the layer of radicalized working people, that would be the base for a real revolutionary socialist party. A party rooted in that significant minority of workers who actually can play leading roles in struggles had ceased to exist. Now, it didn't help that most of these groups made all sorts of subjective errors. In North America, the majority of these groups openly identified with one strand or another of socialism from above, some variant of Stalinism, mostly pro-Chinese Stalinists, some pro-Cuban, Guevarist, but they were basically Stalinists. And as a result, they had a limited repertoire of how to relate to actual struggles they might be involved in. And these groups would swing wildly between ultra-left abstentionism and adaptation to whoever was leading the struggle. For the Trotskyist groups, who had ostensibly better politics, they shared with the Maoist and Stalinist groups a notion that in order for us to win leadership in this growing layer of radical workers, we had to be organizationally and politically homogeneous. Internal debate and discussion was not seen as a sign of health of a group that was rooted in reality and was grappling with new challenges, but instead was seen as deviations. But again, the fundamental problem was that these groups, the human material for their projects didn't exist. And that only actually worsens their commitment to an ideological purity and an organizational despotism in order to make up for that fact. And rather than acknowledging that what we're trying to do may not be possible at this moment, they began to beat up themselves and their members by saying, you're not trying hard enough, you're not disciplined enough, you're not paying it, you're deviating from the line. So that, I would argue, was fundamentally the reason why this project failed. And given the incredibly unrealistic expectations that most of the people who went into these projects had, and I have to include myself as well, I firmly believed until the mid to late 1970s that we were on the verge of the most important political recomposition of the working class since the Russian Revolution. I remained convinced there would be mass splits in the social democratic and communist parties in Europe, and that one or another variant of socialism from below would emerge as a mass current. I, and a very small minority of comrades, were able to adjust our expectations while maintaining fundamentally a revolutionary politics, a politics that understood that even in a period of working class retreat, etc., the difference between reformists and revolutionaries matters in terms of how you conduct even those defensive struggles. The vast majority of the people I radicalized with weren't able to make that transition, and most of them either left politics completely because it was simply pointless, and the majority who remained political adapted to a social democratic or reformist realism.
Yeah, I think that really highlights the importance of having a historical and materialist understanding of the working class. Not treating the working class as an abstraction that jumps from the pages of Marx's Capital, onto social reality, but that there's a very complex process the working class goes through in terms of how forms of organization develop, relationships within the class, different sections of workers are made and then remade, and so on. And so that we have to be much more concrete in how we think about the working class. We're trying to contribute to the self-organization, self-emancipation of that class. But again, that class is not an abstraction, and we have to recognize the ground on which we fight, not just in terms of how capital is organized and what's happening to capitalism, but also where the working class is in relation to all of that.
Right. I mean, people, despite, waving the selected works of Lenin in my day, ignored his most important thing, is that the heart of Marxism is the concrete analysis of the concrete conjuncture, which includes the balance of class forces, which talks about what is the state of working class self-organization and self-activity.
Unfortunately, today, when we look at the far left, most of what's there on the far left has not learned useful lessons from the experience of the generation that you've just talked about. The most visible far left groups either organize using the kind of micro-party model and proclaim themselves to be parties, like the PSL in the US and the RCP in the Canadian state, or they use the micro-party model, what they would call building a Leninist organization, while recognizing in some sense that they're not yet what they see as a party. Freedom Road, Socialist Organization in the US, and Left Voice in the US, and the International Socialists in Canada, I think, would all fall into that category. So this so-called party-building approach generates very strong pressures to act in sectarian ways that don't actually help advance the struggles of the working class and oppressed people, but which may be good for that group in a narrow sense if you think about things like boosting the group's profile, recruiting more members, and so on. And for those groups on the far left that do have at least some commitment to the idea that the emancipation of the working class must be the act of the working class itself, it leads instead to making the group the center of politics, instead of thinking and acting in ways in terms of what that group can do to contribute to the long, complex, messy, and nonlinear process of the working class becoming a force that can change society. And here, I think we should also mention that, in a society which is shaped by sexism, racism, and other forms of oppression, all organizations are going to be scarred by those forms of oppression. Of course, all those of us who are members of these kinds of groups are products of the same society, like everybody else, no matter how sincerely people oppose oppression. Far-left groups that use the micro-party model are, I think, especially prone to dealing badly with oppressive behavior, especially by their leaders. I and 3 other former members of the New Socialist Group wrote a letter in 2019. That's a public letter that you can find linked in the show notes for this episode. There's often a connection between the micro-party approach and inadequate responses by a socialist group to oppressive actions by members. This approach tends to inflate the importance of the group in the minds of its members. Preserving the group often becomes an end in itself. When people make the stability or preservation of the leadership and its so-called Leninist authority their top concern, they may avoid suspending or expelling members, especially leaders, for oppressive behavior. Organizing on micro-party lines with a fetish of leadership can fuel an abusive group culture. That kind of culture reproduces rather than challenges our society's oppressive forms of behavior. And socialist groups that treat their own expansion as what matters most are usually resistant to opening themselves up to struggles against oppression, learning from them, and changing.
Yes, and you comrades were writing in response to the crises of 2 of the largest revolutionary organizations in the English-speaking world, the Socialist Workers' Party of Great Britain, which had lost a significant layer of its membership because it covered up the fact that its industrial organizer was involved in sexual violence and sexual abuse, and that the International Socialist Organization in the U.S. implodes precisely because its leadership had covered up a rape by someone who at the time they were involved in the sexual assault was one of the leadership's favorites. And when it came out, it created a tremendous level of demoralization and led to, essentially, while the British Socialist Workers' Party survives in a much shrunken form today, the International Socialist Organization had no choice but to dissolve itself.
Right. So these are particular forms of the debacle of the micro-party model. What's the alternative to the micro-party model? That's, the key question then that comes up. In the US today, as you know very well, there are a lot more politically active people who consider themselves socialists, who are part of the Democratic Socialists of America, the DSA, far more in the DSA than belong to all the other socialist groups combined. But DSA is politically really pretty broad. Why not in the US just join and build DSA and perhaps one of the many political caucuses within DSA that support a more defined kind of socialist politics?
Well, I actually think that at times in the last decade, DSA was a small and moribund social democratic organization. one of its members, younger members who joined sometime around 2010, said it was a socialist version of the AARP, the American Association of Retired People, which is a nonprofit that collects dues from its members, doesn't expect them to do anything, and sends them a newsletter. DSA explodes as a small mass organization, reaching 70, 80, 90,000 members in the wake not of the Sanders campaign, which many people claim, but in the wake of Trump's first election, 2017, it grows tremendously. And at that point, I was one of the people on the far left saying that the revolutionary socialist left had to relate to this, possibly join it as a grouping with a coherent worldview and with some proposals on how to move DSA forward. Because otherwise, and this is unfortunately what has happened to a great extent, politics like nature abhors a vacuum. And if there weren't revolutionaries posing the alternative of building an activist organization that was really committed to workplace and community and anti-war and anti-imperialist organizing, what we would instead see is the eventual retransformation of DSA into a staid, reformist, electorally oriented grouping. Now, I believe I think from 2017 to early 2020, there were lots of opportunities to work in DSA. And then I think for another couple of years. And in fact, comrades in Tempest, I'd say a majority of our comrades when we formed and for a period of time were members of DSA. And we worked in various DSA branches trying to push for the idea that DSA should not be involved in the Democratic Party. We should be educating and agitating for an independent workers' party, to agitate for more orientation towards building effective rank and file organizations and unions rather than looking to left-leaning officials who might be friendly to DSA's politics. Now, there was space for that for quite a while, and some currents did grow. The problem was none of these currents had enough size, political coherence, and weight to really have much of an impact. And what we, especially a turning point came in 2021, 2022 in DSA. In 2018, a number of DSA members and DSA-endorsed candidates won Democratic primaries and actually got elected to the House of Representatives in the U.S., the so-called squad. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez being the best known, Rashid Tlaib, and there was also an African-American congressperson from the Bronx and part of the suburbs outside of New York named Jamal Bowman who was elected. Now, all of these candidates, in order to get DSA's endorsement, publicly endorsed boycott, divestment, sanctions against the Zionist state, against Israel, and pledged to promote those politics. Bowman, almost as soon as he's elected, ends up voting to fund the Iron Shield missile system that essentially allows the Israeli state to rain terror on Palestinians and on its Arab neighbors without much worry about them sending missiles in and actually hitting Israeli targets. This sparked a tremendous debate in DSA, and our comrades played a big role in initiating a movement in various branches calling for, at the minimum, Bowman to be censured, if not expelled from DSA for basically disregarding the politics of the organization. In other words, this was an attempt on the part of the members of DSA to hold their so-called electeds accountable. The DSA leadership, including those who claim to be on the left of the DSA leadership, responded by saying, our main priority is to support Jamal Bowman. And they ended up basically taking a number of organizational moves against centers of opposition on this question. In particular, they shut down the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions Working Group, which had been involved in the call to expel Bowman, and basically removed its leadership and appointed a leadership that would not openly criticize Bowman. In the wake of that, thousands, probably up to 20,000 members of DSA left the organization, stopped paying dues, stopped going to meetings, etc. And by 2022, I believe, when several DSA members, including and Sanders, supported Biden's breaking of the railway strike, there was practically no opposition. And what you started to see in many of the branches is that became more and more bureaucratic and authoritarian. So, for example, our comrades were very active in the New York City labor branch of DSA, which had been a place where people involved in organizing rank and file caucuses in various public sector unions had been very active in talking about their work and trying to coordinate it, et cetera. Increasingly, the leadership of that branch was appointed by the citywide leadership, which is very conservative. And basically the branch discussions no longer included discussions of the fight in the teachers union or the fight in the big public employees unions, but what candidates were going to support for state assembly and city council, more and more narrowly electoralist. Now, today in New York and Tempest, we're beginning to reassess this because there seems to be, in the wake of the election of Zoran Mamdani as New York City mayor, as an open member of DSA, there's renewed discussion. There seems to be some ferment within New York City DSA. A few weeks back, the leadership of the branch held a meeting which they instructed people online not to share any information about the information. And if they did, they'd be expelled from DSA. Despite that, it did get shared out. And their line was, our job, once Mamdani is elected, is not to hold him accountable, but to help him govern, which means we're there to help cover for him as he retreats in face of pressure from the Democratic Party, from Capitol, et cetera. And there seems to be a considerable minority of members in New York DSA who are not going along with that. And that's something, so that we're beginning to reassess that. For me, it's a tactical question. DSA is, in its majority, a social democratic organization, which in the United States means that it doesn't even advocate its own electoral party. It tries to remake the capitalist Democratic Party. It is a party that sees DSA as an organization which has come to see elections as electing people as taking power, and who see all other forms of political organizing as subordinate to that. But there have been times, particularly from 2017 to 2021, where it attracted lots of radicalized people who wanted more than that, and there might be some opportunity today. The problem is, and this is something we saw with many of these caucuses that formed in DSA, was that as the group shrank in the early 2020s, and there was less opportunity to actually influence new people, these groups became sort of power groups, concerned solely with winning positions on leadership bodies rather than organizing politically. Which is always the problem with revolutionaries working in larger, predominantly reformist organizations. But again, it's a tactical question. There may be openings in DSA in the coming year or so in New York. We'll see. I am, in principle, not opposed to it. In fact, I actually thought that it was imperative that revolutionaries join DSA and promote our ideas within DSA when it was a growing, radicalizing group.
Yeah, and I should add that in the context of the Canadian state, we don't have anything even like DSA, and there's a certain amount of unfortunate DSA envy among people on the left here. What we have is the New Democratic Party, which is a weakened social democratic party that has really adapted to neoliberalism. The European term social liberal fits pretty well for it, although there certainly are people who are NDP members who are more left-wing than that. There's currently an election process for the new leader of the federal NDP, where there is one or possibly two left candidates running. But at the grassroots level, NDP constituency associations are not, with very few exceptions, they're not activist organizations or places that attract people who are looking to do more than be involved in some way around elections. In Quebec, there's also Quebec Solidaire, which is a left-wing party. It was originally formed, meant as an alternative to the nationalist Parti Québécois and more right-wing parties. And Quebec Solidaire originally talked about being a so-called party of the ballot box and the streets, combining both elections and non-electoral work, although it, I think, fundamentally leaned in an electoral direction. And it has become, it became more successful, electing more members of the National Assembly in Quebec, but also moved to the right through that process with more influence of the MNAs and their staff and so on within the party apparatus. And so although it certainly remains a not insignificant organization, there's not very much of the street and fundamentally an electoral approach to that party. And the left has had a difficult time organizing itself in relation to Quebec Solidaire. So I think if people who've been listening to this discussion have been listening carefully, you recognize that we understand, Charlie and I, that it's a mistake to think that the only options people have when it comes to socialist organization are, on the one hand, broad organizations like the DSA with members that range all the way from moderate reformists to revolutionaries, with all the problems that Charlie has talked about. And on the other hand, so-called micro parties, far left groups organized along those lines. There have been, and there still are, revolutionary socialist groups that reject the micro party model and, well, still affirming the commitment to the revolutionary transformation of society, try to organize in ways that make sense where they are, in the spirit of what British socialist Duncan Hallas once wrote, which is that organizations do not exist in a vacuum. They are composed of actual people in specific situations attempting to solve real problems with a limited range of options open to them. And one of those groups that tried to carve out a different path was the one that you were in, Charlie, Solidarity. And Solidarity was certainly an influence on the group I was in, the New Socialist group in Canada. Can you share some thoughts about the strengths and weaknesses of Solidarity in the years that you were a member between 86 and 2015?
All right. I think that it combined in the early years, there was throughout the history of Solidarity, there was a extremely strong and healthy commitment to training comrades to be be activists and militants, particularly at the workplace. We had two of the groups that came together to form Solidarity, Workers' Power and the International Socialists, had a decade or more of experience doing workplace activism as revolutionary socialists. And there was a layer of comrades who were my age and a bit older who were very excited about training young people to continue doing that work. And in the early years, I'd say up until about 93, 94, 95, there was also a continued strong commitment to training people in the broad politics of revolutionary socialism from below, on the need for revolution, the need for class independence, the importance of anti-oppression struggles, etc. Over time, especially this becomes more and more evident in the 1990s and then later, particularly in the 2000s, Solidarity was unable to maintain those two strengths, both a commitment to training people in revolutionary politics combined with grappling with the world as it is today, attempting to understand the nature of the economic crisis, the nature of the restructuring of the working class and the oppressed, etc. We're doing that, I'd say, until the mid-90s, combined with continued training people as activists. I think we began to abandon, particularly the second, and that had an effect on how we train people as activists. Our commitment to maintaining revolutionary politics and training people in these politics weakened over time, and this then affected how we were training people to do day-to-day organizing. I think that the weakening of our commitment to training people in revolutionary politics had two sources. One source was a demoralization of a layer of older comrades of my age and older, about the prospects of revolutionary politics. A number of them, including leading comrades, came to the conclusion that the idea of revolution was simply unrealistic, and the best we could hope for is to build left reformism. At the same time, we were opening ourselves to continue. We had projected ourselves as a regroupment organization, an organization that would bring together people from a variety of political traditions and try to cohere something new. Initially, in the mid-'80s, we thought we could include some of the people who had coming out of the Maoist milieu, who had drawn conclusions about microsect-partyism and about Stalinism. Those folks never showed. And what we ended up with is, by the early 90s, regroupment meant integrating layers of people who had come out of primarily the crisis of the main Trotskyist organizations in the United States, who had not drawn lessons about the micro-party. These are people who thought that their previous organization had gone wrong because of some ideological deviation and unclarity about, what Trotskyism is, rather than, hey, the project was flawed because that layer of working people that would be the basis of a revolutionary party simply didn't exist. These people were concerned. So we had, on the one hand, a layer of older comrades who were saying, all these questions about the restructuring of the working class, the restructuring of the economy, all this other stuff, it's not that important anymore. We just have to do practice. And then these other folks are going, all we need to do is read Trotsky and memorize the transitional program and be able to spit it out, and we'll be fine. The result was we would recruit periodically layers of young people who would either become good workplace militants but drift to the right politically, adapting to the trade union officialdom, or who would try to transform the group into a more coherent revolutionary group that did real activism, would leave. And by 2011, to be quite honest, I had been trying to keep the group on what I saw as a reasonable path. I'd been very active through the 80s and 90s in my branch in New York, which at points was fairly successful, had up to 40, 50 people, which for us was large. And I served in national leadership from 2000 to about 2008. I came to the conclusion by 2011 that the group was going nowhere, and I was pulling back from my activity. For personal reasons, I was dropped to sympathizer in 2013. But then in 2015, the group voted, and there's a group that has shrunk tremendously. At our height, we were 350, 400 members. By 2015, if they had 100 members on paper and 30 active, it was a lot. The group voted to participate in the Sanders challenge in the Democratic primary, at which point I left and decided that this group had reached its limits and wasn't going anywhere. Now, Solidarity still exists. They still have some very good comrades who I have tremendous personal and political respect for, but they don't seem to be a vibrant organization that's recruiting new people, that's capable of having an impact on the left, not on the world, but at least on the left. So for me, the big failure of Solidarity was the inability to define what broadly it means to be, what were the boundaries of being a revolutionary socialist group, and then training new members in the fundamentals of those politics while encouraging them to think about the world and think about their activity as revolutionary socialists. And what we ended up with is the group essentially politically, not organizationally, liquidated itself into a more amorphous left reformist current.
Thank you for that. It's a sad story, but an instructive one. And it brings us to the question of the Tempest Collective, which you're a member of. I'm also a member. It's a U.S. organization that also welcomes members in the Canadian state. And Tempest is trying to build a socialist organization.
We'll take anybody's dues. No, not quite.
Yeah. So Tempest is trying to build a socialist group that rejects the micro-party model and also tries to avoid repeating the problems of Solidarity and other really loose groups. The Tempest website puts it this way: we need new forms of revolutionary organization that can better meet this moment, that can bring fresh eyes to how we make revolutionary organization relevant to what's happening and what needs to be done. We do not claim to have the answer to how a new revolutionary organizational form will come about. We want to contribute to the process of figuring out how to strengthen organized socialist forces in this era of worsening crises, a process that is underway in many different publications and organizations. And of course, there are groups in other countries with a similar approach to Tempest. So just to wrap up, what do you think is the most important thing for people in very small groups like this to bear in mind about how we approach building a socialist organization?
Well, I think the most fundamental thing is to be aware of and have a real grip on analysis of the pitfalls of both ideological and political and organizational looseness, however we want to call it, that a notion that, all we have to do is be active. We don't really need to develop our thinking as revolutionary Marxists. We need to reject that, which I think was the problem with Solidarity, and at the same time, reject the microsect model, which was the problem with the International Socialist Organization. And Tempest, in some ways, was formed by mostly people who had survived the breakup of the International Socialist Organization, and a small number of us who had survived as revolutionaries from the disorganization of Solidarity, and trying to find and realize that while we know those are the two directions we don't want to go, on the broad path in the middle, we have at best a compass, but not a roadmap. And this, in some ways, comrades joked at our founding conference that we're building the plane while flying it. This is an experiment, another experiment. And I think I have been very pleased, very happy with how the Tempest Collective collectively has attempted to find our way. We were willing to be active in DSA as revolutionaries, but not sectarians who are going there to lecture people on the correct program. We are seen as good workplace activists, as good social movement activists, but people who have a clear politics. We related to the Bernie, AOC, and now Mamdani phenomena, not by being purist, sectarian denunciation of, the only solution is a revolutionary party, and understand that the support for these left-wing populist, left-wing Democratic Party politicians is a sign of people searching for a left-wing collectivist solidaristic alternative to the crisis, to capitalist politics and to right-wing populism, but at the same time understanding that that the Democratic Party is a trap for revolutionaries and for radicals. So I've been pleased by how we've been able to do that. There is no guarantees we will be successful. The odds, the pressures on small groups to adapt to either sectarian, a comfortable microsect model, or to just adapt to the milieu you're in are very, very strong. But I've been very happy so far and very pleased so far with the way in which our collective has responded and continued to grow, integrate people, etc. And to be honest, it is also one of the most healthy organizations I've been in. Solidarity in its early days, we had really good, honest, healthy debates about real questions facing revolutionaries. As the group became depoliticized, the nature of discussions, not only did the discussion level drop to, mundane, what do we do next, not in terms of, what is to be done, but, what do we advocate tomorrow? And it became incredibly personalized and toxic atmosphere, as bad as what comrades describe in microsects. So we've succeeded so far, but again, we know what our guardrails are. The microsect on one hand, political adaptation on the other. But on that road, that broad path, we at best have a compass. We don't have a roadmap.
And I think we can say, based on our discussions today, that the fate of Tempest and all other attempts to build non-sectarian revolutionary socialist organizations of one kind or another, the fate of these projects are really deeply wrapped up, shaped by the fate of the working class and, the social struggles that are happening and will happen in the future. Those are the powerful forces that will ultimately, blow an organization one way or another. And the best you can do is try to understand where those forces are blowing and where they're moving and how you can most effectively try to navigate through that. I'm slaughtering the metaphor as I go, but I think the point should be clear that our fate is not going to be something that we make in a vacuum, but in circumstances that we find ourselves thrust into.
Right. You actually do need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows.
On that note, thanks so much for this, Charlie.
No problem. Great. Always great to do this, David.
That's it for this episode of Victor's Children. I'd like to thank Jonathan Croker, the producer of Victor's Children, without whom the podcast wouldn't be possible. I'd also like to thank Posey Legg, who designed the graphic for Victor's Children. If you found the episode worth listening to, please do tell other people about the show, since word-of-mouth recommendations are especially helpful. If you don't subscribe through your preferred podcast app, please do. And while you're there, please give the show a high rating. It helps to promote us. If you have a suggestion for an episode or some other kind of constructive feedback, feel free to be in touch with me. You can contact me through victorschildren@gmail.com.